Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Looks like the lights are a little bright, but looks like pretty solid turnout out there, so thanks for spending your morning with us. My name is Hillary Bright. I'm the U.S. Vice President for Renewables for the Exodus Group, and we're here today to talk about, I feel like, an issue we've heard come up in the previous conversation, and I think will continue to come up multiple times, but really a deep dive into the West Coast supply chain. Challenging issue, but in my mind also a tremendous opportunity that we have in the state for a lot of different reasons, both the success of the industry, but also to the constituents of California and the potential workforce that exists here. So we can define supply chain in a lot of different ways. I think in conversation with the panel, in preparation, supply chain is not only sort of the OEMs and tier one massive components. It really reaches into tier 2, 3, 4 components around infrastructure, vessels, construction equipment. It's a wide-reaching area that needs to be considered to really pull together the entire industry. So in this panel, we will have developers, manufacturers of the turbines themselves, to really dig into sort of how do we think about this? How does California look to achieve sort of its ambitious floating offshore wind goals? So I'll stop there and let my panel introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into questions. So Michelle, I'll turn it over to you for interest.
Great, thank you. Good morning, I'm Michelle Bardini, Offshore Public Affairs Manager at Vestas. Vestas is a wind turbine manufacturer and service provider with 9 gigawatts of offshore wind installed to date globally. In the US, we are working to install offshore wind in New York and New Jersey as the preferred supplier for Empire Wind and Atlantic Shores. We are also working to advance floating offshore wind technology and have installed floating turbines at pilot project test sites in Europe and are the preferred supplier for 2 floating projects in South Korea. We are really eager to support the build out of a sustainable supply chain here on the West Coast by drawing on the lessons from East Coast and other markets that we've been a part of. We really do have the opportunity to scale up smarter and really set up the market in a way that attracts and builds the foundation for a competitive and scalable supply chain here on the West. Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. I'm going next. Tim Fischer, representing Rambøll, a Danish headquartered global consultancy with also 2,000 people in the US. I have to say that while we're in the business since 30 years, have also worked in the US, I think, since almost 20 years, since Cape Wind. We're here. I'm representing the global wind team, so that is around about 700 people. I do have globally. And what we do is what you maybe could say end-to-end consultancy, really starting from early phase auction support all the way down to permitting development towards engineering construction. In the US context, probably 2 projects most people know us for. I mean, we are working since several years on New Jersey, the strategic plan, as one of the key consultants driving the strategy for New Jersey. And the second project we are really, really proud about is CVOW in Virginia, because we are actually the development partner towards Dominion, basically providing the complete development organization into that project, where the first monopiles are actually on the way offshore this week, which is super exciting. So project on schedule, on budget, 2.5 gigawatts soon to be installed in the US. So I think that's a really, really great reference. Maybe in the context of today, I'm 20 years plus in the business in wind. I'm actually working since 18 years in the floating business. I just counted that yesterday, which is a bit scary. But I've actually started in 2006 already with a guy called Jason Jonkman from NREL, looking into floating technology. So I'm in the business since quite a while, and yeah, we're looking very much forward to the discussion today and to contribute.
Great.
Saul.
And good morning. My name is Saul Rosser. I'm the engineering manager for RWE's project in Northern California. And so my task is to lead the team to figure out what we're going to build and how we're going to build it and where we can build it. So supply chain's right down the middle of that task. Personally, and then I'll talk about RWE in a second, but personally, when I was 11, I was living in the desert in Arizona, and I wanted to build stuff on the ocean. And so I pursued that, and we're building stuff on the ocean. I have spent the last few years working with a local company or a California-based company that designs floating foundations, including the one in the image on screen. Sorry, I guess it's no longer on screen, but on many of the handouts, called Principal Power. So I work with them quite a bit, and we worked with Vestas to integrate turbines to make floating offshore wind work. That was at small scales, 3 to 5 units, and now we're talking 50, 60, 70 units. So RWE is a global leader, a developer of offshore wind with a lot of fixed bottom assets in Europe particularly, but strong ambitions in floating offshore wind, including this lease in Northern California. So good morning, thank you.
Great. So pretty obvious here, a lot of experience from a lot of different perspectives, which I think is really critical for the industry in general and advancing it. It interconnects in so many ways, so I'm really excited to hear sort of how all of the insights tie together. So we'll start off with Tim and Michelle. So West Coast states have stated a target of 28 gigawatts up and down the West Coast over the next 2 decades. So let's start thinking through how we sort of lay the opportunities to achieve that target. So Tim, Michelle, can you sort of briefly walk us through some of the manufacturing elements for offshore wind that could potentially be produced in California, maybe some of those opportunities that are coming early, knowing the conversations are early, and sort of what are some of the key differences that need to be considered between turbine elements, floating foundations, et cetera? It's just some grounding for how we start this conversation.
Ladies first.
Okay. So yeah, to achieve those targets that you mentioned, the 28 gigawatts, success ultimately hinges on establishing a financially viable and scalable supply chain. And as you mentioned earlier at the start of the panel, when we talk about the supply chain, this really refers to the entire ecosystem that really needs to come together to deploy the first projects, install them, and operate them long term. So as California looks to develop a local supply chain, it's really important that it is globally cost competitive in order to drive down the cost of energy. So there's a global supply chain that already exists for major turbine components such as blades and nacelles that can be leveraged in the near term to support the projects here on the West Coast. So really, West Coast states can look at the components and supply chain needs that don't yet have an established global supply chain, and where the region can have a competitive advantage in attracting those investments. Especially early on, we can leverage a global and local supply chain to provide flexibility and reduce risk, and also enable developers some flexibility to select the most cost-effective and viable solution for their specific project. I would just also add that one, note of caution is, I would say that at this stage of the industry, we really should be measuring success as successful deployment of the first projects to achieve these targets, rather than the number of factories built. First things first, we do need ports and transmission, or there is no offshore wind. And these are critical local infrastructure projects that will bring thousands of jobs in the near term. So, making sure that we're prioritizing first things first and kind of building this out sequentially.
Yeah, and difficult. Where to start? I mean, first of all, the good thing is I'm an independent consultant, so I can share whatever I think. The thing is, I mean, the supply chain equation on the East Coast is already difficult, but on the West Coast it's even more difficult. And I mean, I think important is that we differentiate when we talk about supply chain. What do we really mean? Do we really mean fabrication of component? Do we mean assembly of components? And I think that's quite a difference, right? We already see on the East Coast with quite a volume on foundations, turbines, we still struggle to actually attract investment into local fabrication. So how likely will it be to happen on the West Coast? So I think we have to be also honest and realistic. I don't think for the first set of projects we will see a massive investment into fabrication here. What we will need is actually local assembly, right? And I think probably in all the sessions, I mean, we talked about the 3 important P's here, right? Ports. So it starts with infrastructure. And then we are probably talking about assembly rather than fabrication. I think that is a very, very important differentiation. I think where we as an industry also have to be honest, because will you fabricate steel structures on the West Coast of California? Most probably not. You'll probably prefabricate them elsewhere, bring them here, assemble them here. The thing is, it's a fairly complex technology in floating wind, and that's probably the biggest challenge. It's still a technology that is not yet globally solved. I mean, in bottom fixed, we do have more or less 2 solutions. So you know what to do in floating wind. There are, I think, 90 plus different technologies out there. They all come with different challenges, fabrication, assembly requirements. So it makes it a bit difficult to say that's the technology now and that is the investment required to do it, because it's pretty different if you do concrete, steel, whatever type of technology. So I think we have to give us time to also assess what is the best solution for the region, and in the meantime prepare what we will for sure need for it, and that's ports and that's space for assembly. And then probably California and the West Coast has to really make a good assessment on what can you as a state or as a region differentiate on the global context. Will you become a steel fabricator state? I'm not so sure. But can you, for example, mooring lines is a good example, right? I mean, a gigawatt project floating wind will probably require more mooring lines that are available on the global market, right? We talk probably 200 plus miles of mooring lines. It's not existing. So someone has to invest into that new supply somewhere globally. Could that be something you do in California also as an export option? Because I think supply chain will also require export opportunities, because just solely for the West Coast, I think none of the cases will fly. So same with substations. I mean, I had a lively discussion about that yesterday with someone. These big substations are pretty labor intensive. Theoretically, you could produce them in Asia, but they probably have to float, which is quite complex. Will you do that really then in Asia? Probably that is something. So long story short, it's a fairly difficult equation. And I think the technology itself will still need a couple of years to be really converge into something that is really applicable. And in the meantime, I think we have to just start the right investments, and that's mainly in infrastructure, the ability to assemble things, because that is the first thing we will see over the next 10 years, 15 years here. Great. So rather assembly than fabrication. I think that's an important keyword.
Great, thank you. Saul, anything you'd like to add?
I think just to give an RWE perspective, what we're trying to achieve. First, personally, I've lived in California most of the last 12 years. I want to see stuff built here in California. And our current task is to understand what's possible. And not just what's possible, but what are the cost trade-offs. The state of California is going to procure electricity from offshore wind. That's the intent. And there may be cost trade-offs with local content versus globally sourced content. And I think that's perfectly right. That's the right answer. The trade-offs need to be made. And our goal as a developer in our project is to understand what those trade-offs look like and to inform the policymakers as they prepare for offtake. The other thing I want to say, and I think it's really important, and this was mentioned in some ways, was that when we look at the whole scope of the projects, RWE and other developers are going to supply a certain portion. Here in the US, we go from the point of interconnect on land, and then we go offshore to the wind turbines. But there's a lot more here. There's the ports and there's the transmission. There's all sorts of things that go into this that won't be built by the developer. And that is all, or many of that by definition, really has to be done locally. And I think it's really important. So starting these early projects with that broad understanding that we're creating a lot of local opportunity through the overall ecosystem, and then working over time to get as much as we can here in California. I think A is valuable because California ratepayers are paying for the electricity, but also that staged approach, or being realistic, I should say, and being honest with ourselves is really important. Where the policymakers decide to land, I think we're pretty open to. We want to see the projects work, we want to see it work for California, and we want to inform that discussion. So yeah, we're here as partners. There are supply chain participants in the audience today. We're here to work with you and learn from you and help you make connections, help you understand where you can fit into the puzzle. And we're here also for policymakers to have the discussion about what we see as possible. There'll be a lot of voices there, but our goal is to add our voice to that conversation.
That's great. And I think such important points that there's the opportunity for sort of some of the larger components, maybe mooring lines, also with that export, that global export capability, just huge for business stability and long-term, attracting that long-term investment. And then thinking about how we leverage the existing businesses and things in California, right? Let's get those folks who maybe have that adjacency to the supply chain and offshore wind into that market as well, not just looking at sort of like the one single big kind of component manufacturer. It's really a web of companies and opportunities that are going to make this all come together for the industry in a responsible and sustainable kind of way. So we touched on a couple of things there, and just in terms of the investment, and I think Tim, you specifically brought up sort of the challenges that have been experienced on the East Coast of attracting the level of investment that's truly needed for the supply chain we're thinking about. So I'll just leave this up to the panel, but Tim, if you would kick us off, what do you feel like are some of the key elements in California that are needed to really help attract that investment?
Yeah, before I answer that, I forgot to say one thing. Another very important thing we need to differentiate talking supply chain, it's a common mistake, is we need to look at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Everyone always wants a turbine vendor,
Yep.
the floating manufacturer, right? I mean, I can tell you, assessing the state of New York and New Jersey in all this detail, there's a tremendous amount of work out there for tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. So also differentiating between what is really already available, what you can really change into offshore wind specific. So there's a lot. So we also have to really broaden our view away from tier 1 only. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we can learn from East Coast, from the global market. I think I think one very important thing, it already came on some of the other talks here, is honestly transparency. I think we as an industry have also to be transparent on what does it take. As I said, I mean, don't promise a tier 1 fabrication facility in 3 years in California. And certainly there's things we can learn from the East Coast, right? I mean, a good example is, for example, the public investment into the port in New Jersey, the wind port. So again, we've discussed a lot about ports, but decoupling actually an important investment into infrastructure from the developers, I think is a key thing you can copy, just because it is required. Also, it has a decent size. So we need actually facilities that are sizable, big enough to facilitate different usage. It could be marshalling, it could be an assembly, because I think we will need infrastructure that is flexible for the usage, because all the developers, many of them will probably choose even different technologies. So that's maybe one clear learning on the positive. On the negative, we have to be very careful to not make shortcuts. I mean, on the East Coast, I know it's many, many years ago, but there's a famous port of New Bedford, right, where someone invested. There was a lot of public money spent into a very small port just for the purpose of one small project, and just a couple of years later it was already outdated in terms of size. So let's not do the same mistake and just fix something small scale for 1 or 2 projects. We have to think big from the beginning, because otherwise these investments are maybe, you just throw them out of the window. That's maybe something you shouldn't repeat. And then I think the solicitation, the ORIC, the market design will be key as everywhere, right? And there's a clear lessons learned. Do not combine a race to the bottom on levelized cost of energy directly with only creating local jobs. I mean, you will kill the business immediately, I can tell you. So you need a smarter market design that looks at it broader. I mean, we tend to, I mean, I'm really globally promoting sustainability as really a key differentiator. In addition to cost, obviously cost has to be focused, but sustainability can bring so much more. Sustainability is local jobs. It is actually the impact to the society. It's the impact to the environment. So I think we need to spend a bit of a broader picture that you can use to actually quantify in the end what is actually a good concept going forward, because I think that is required to really moderate actually the process of getting the investments into the country. Because if you're too strict from the beginning, saying low cost, maximize jobs. We had that in New York. We had that elsewhere. I mean, I don't think it works. So I think there are quite a few things to learn from the East Coast, and I think the most important one is port, and decoupling the investment really into such crucial infrastructure from the developers. Yeah. I think also even the supply chain, we saw that just recently in New York, right? Coupling the developers to direct investment into a turbine vendor is not a winning story, so don't do that. So decouple it. I think the public has to carry its part, and then the developers, they can chip in later, but you clearly have to decouple it. I think that's probably one thing to share.
Super
but happy to hear other views on that.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with what was said. I think to step back a bit, the top line banner item is there needs to be visibility on procurement. There needs to be a clear roadmap for procuring offshore wind, and it needs to be at scale. As I mentioned before, I've worked on projects of 3-5 units of floating. We can make it float. We know how to make it float. We know how to make it survive offshore. The trick now is to make it cost effective, or to improve the cost effectiveness. And that doesn't mean doing it cheap. That doesn't mean cutting corners. That means finding the balance of cost versus benefits and spending money where appropriate. But that really is driven by scale, and that means, and here in California, scale of procurement. So right now we have the 5 leases in the last panel. It was talked about the future lease rounds and the timing for that. That's important, but so, and perhaps even more so, is the state's commitment to the procurement activity. The money comes from procurement, generally speaking, and that's where supply chain partners and developers and others will engage in with the industry, make commitments. And what we would like to see, what I would like to see, is let me back up. I think business is a pretty individual activity. Like, it's personal, I should say. We work together, but it's a personal thing. It affects us each personally. And why I say that and why I mention that is that I want to see people as individuals, as part of their companies, make commitments to California and the West Coast. And so we've seen that with our organization and others where people have come to California to set up an office, to bring their expertise from Europe or from Asia or wherever the other offshore wind or floating activities are happening. And that happens, that expertise starts to show up when we have that visibility towards a long-term procurement, long-term leases. And so we want to have a supply chain here that requires expertise here, that requires incentivization, and fundamentally that comes down to procurement. There are other things that are really important, transmission, ports, et cetera, but at the end of the day, the commitment to a robust, visionary, if you will, procurement schedule is really, really important.
Thank you, so Michelle, please weigh in there.
Yeah, completely agree. And to build onto that, ultimately, when suppliers are looking to make investments, they ultimately need volume, which is, pipeline of projects year over year through procurement. And that volume needs to be long-term, it needs to be predictable, firm, and execute on a clear schedule to give the supply chain line of sight, market certainty, and then therefore greater confidence to invest in that market. So for example, it's a massive investment to open a factory, and in order to sustain a factory over the long term and therefore sustain and provide reliable long-term jobs for the workers in those factories, we really need a long-term pipeline of volume, really spanning decades. Of course, we don't want a scenario where we open a factory and then have to close its doors a few years later because we didn't have enough volume to keep the factory running. So procurement is a critical mechanism to providing that volume and to providing it early on, providing that visibility, as you mentioned, to give that supply chain some line of sight and greater confidence. I would also add, that when we go through this procurement process, we also need really firm PPAs that are executing on a clear schedule and really adjust to macroeconomic conditions, so we avoid, rebids or renegotiations later down the road that causes the start and stop that also hinders the supply chain development and causes further delays or bottlenecks. I also wanted to touch briefly, in terms of procurement, how volume and this timeline is so critical. But from lessons on the East Coast, it's very clear that domestic manufacturing requirements as a condition for offtake has hindered industry build-out on the East Coast and really should be avoided on the West Coast. Instead, we should be attracting investments across the supply chain or the entire value chain, really, by providing this long-term predictable volume through procurement, executing on a clear schedule, rather than imposing restrictive requirements. This is really critical just to enable the supply chain to be established and also be sustainable over the long term.
So hearing lots of, I think, really excellent points, and hearing procurement come up. Obviously, I think one of the key topics that we've heard a lot about, and there is a panel this afternoon that will deep dive into procurement, but it's certainly not a conversation we can ignore as part of supply chain. So let's dig in a little bit more to procurement. So a lot of different pieces there: predictability, line of sight. How, and I'll just start with you, Michelle. I think we'll just go down the line. Everyone will have thoughts on this. I guess from the state perspective, what are you really looking for and advice to policymakers of things you've maybe seen in other regions that are really those pieces that need to be in that procurement? I know you touched on those, but dig a little deeper on sort of the PPA and various things.
Sure, yeah, a few different elements are really critical. Like we talked about before, significant long-term volume that's on a clear, predictable timeline provides that visibility. So that's ultimately, incredibly critical. Having those PPAs, when they are executed, be viable and firm, so the supply chain can then build behind it to support the project, is really critical. So having inflation indexes and mechanisms to adjust with macroeconomic conditions is really critical to enable that these projects move forward and we don't have rebids or renegotiations that cause delays. On a different angle, though, and something we haven't touched on, is the past state-run solicitations on the East Coast have lacked focus on project execution. And so that's one area that I really think the West Coast can learn from and really evaluate project execution during the solicitation process, so we can prioritize projects that utilize mature technology that is going to be available for commercial deployment on time, and also demonstrates credible, viable project execution plans, so we again avoid those delays that we've been seeing on the East Coast. This includes, like, is there interconnection access? Is the necessary port and installation infrastructure available? And will the necessary turbine technology as well as the floating foundation technology be commercially available on time to support that project? These are all really critical pieces that we need to be evaluating during this solicitation process to ensure we're prioritizing and moving forward projects that are on a clear path to on-time deployment. I can pause there and allow my other fellows to.
Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I may just have to, again, play a little bit the devil's advocate here on the procurement topic, because I fully agree it's important, but again, clear lessons learned from East Coast, it will not solve it, right? I mean, even if you have all the procurement, you have tons of OREX outs, developers may still pull out, right? It's still not giving you the security you need. I mean, maybe I just put the global perspective. I mean, we are currently in the global market have actually a quite challenging trilemma, I would call it. We have a global supply chain challenge, we all know that, which of course means that investors, they'll probably make one investment and they have to pick their battles, right? Do I do it in Europe and Asia and yes, they can't do it all over, similar for other big tier one suppliers. So we have a clear supply chain challenge, we all know that. But we also have a new challenge, we have seen that more and more, is actually the shareholder pressure on big developers, which I wouldn't underestimate. So we do see big developers that are actually so much under pressure to get returns of the project that they do not fear to step out of PPAs again. So we also have to, that's the second one, and the third actually trilemma, and which I found most concerning in the US at the moment, is the society. Do we win the society for us to join us on the path towards offshore wind, or do we lose them? And I think that's for me at the moment the biggest problem on the East Coast, with all these ups and downs, right? Start and stop, supply chain, all of that, we can all handle that, but the society, we're losing the society. So therefore, I think a realistic, a transparent market design that has a mid and long-term perspective involves the society from the beginning. We are open about cost of energy. I think there are clear lessons learned from the global market, right? If you want local jobs, you need to be willing to pay more for electricity. It's a pure fact. That's what Taiwan has done successfully. Or you say, like we have done in Denmark or in Germany, say, well, we want the lowest possible energy, but bring it from wherever you want, right? So I think for me, again, market design for me is a key enabler, and I mean, in particular, to not lose the society, because that's for me in this trilemma globally the biggest challenge we have. Because if we do not get the society on our side, I mean, I had yesterday a 3.5-minute Uber drive back to the hotel, and the guy said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Offshore wind." I said, "Offshore wind? Why should we do offshore wind?" And I tried to convince him in 3.5 minutes, which was challenging. I think I made a few steps forward. But it's a difficult discussion, right? To tell someone here, why should I actually pay more for an offshore wind farm and not do solar? I mean, you know that better than I do, right? So we should not lose the society, and I think we have a great opportunity here from the very beginning. Get them involved, be transparent about the opportunities, about the risks, about the cost. And then I think there's a good potential for the industry as a whole. But procurement only won't solve it. We have seen that in New Jersey, New York, unfortunately, and Massachusetts. Yeah.
I recognize we're at the risk of kind of preaching to the policymakers, and I don't want to do that without first congratulating the state of California and some of the federal players on what has been achieved. There's been a lot of positive engagement. There's been a lot of positive action in the right direction here. And so it's really important that we recognize that. And so in no way do I want to come off as downplaying that or not really, really appreciating that. And there's a lot more to do. Now, in terms of appreciating it, I think the big picture I want to make here is that I've lived in California for 12 years. We've had horrible wildfires. I've been in San Francisco in the smoke clouds enough to wonder if I was staying or not. It's pretty intense, or it can be, and there's been all sorts of other weather extremes. And I applaud the state, I applaud the federal government for the steps they're taking to address this. There is a lot more to do, and there are a lot of people eager to address this. So as we come back then to what does procurement look like, and then how do we move beyond that? Again, congratulations on what's been done. It's really important for there to be a market here to drive the costs down. And then what I would add to that is it's really important, or at least the way I like to approach this is with humility. And specifically with procurement, the humility is we don't know what these things are going to cost. We're making the industry is making massive strides to improve costs. There are, I'm a foundation expert, I'll leave the turbines to others, but on the foundations, there are a number of California companies, I won't list them all, who are working to significantly improve the cost. That can be changing the fabrication mode to make it more automated panel facilities for steel panels. Or it could be looking at using concrete foundations with maybe the hope of more local content out of that to be proven. But then there's other technologies out there or other technology developers who are working on quite, I don't know if radical is the term, but new ways to build foundations, to take the structural loads, to support the fabrication and assembly activity. And this space is moving so quickly that with these, for me at least, from my perspective, with the 5 leases that are out there, we don't know what they're going to cost, we don't know what they're going to look like, but we also don't know with the next lease round and the years to come as we move beyond these first leases, what that's going to look like. So let's be humble, let's have an open conversation internally with ourselves, so to speak, but also within the industry and with the policymakers about recognizing we don't know, but there's a lot of work towards improving cost. And that's, at least in my job, that's the core question. Where can we get the right cost-benefit ratio? How can we drive that?
Thanks, Saul. I appreciate that. Take the moment to celebrate where we've come.
Yeah,
There's a lot, and I think we're constantly facing the challenges and the changes. So we dive right into like, how do we overcome this, and are we failing at this, and how do we get it right? So absolutely appreciate it. In my short time, only 5-6 years, focused on offshore wind, the development and the advancement that we've seen is absolutely amazing, and I think that's also just a testament to why we're seeing the challenges now, because we're diving in, right? We're getting in deep, and we have to answer these questions. Tim, you said something really interesting that resonates a lot with me, is a policy background and sort of stakeholder engagement, this connection, keeping society involved, and really seeing the benefit, and not only through potentially, reasonably priced electricity, but also, going back into the companies that exist that could be in the supply chain, the tier 2s and 3s. What do you feel like from the state, or what have you seen potentially in other global markets that really help to get those companies that exist into the supply chain? To me, if we can make that benefit, that people see their economic future in this industry, there's no better way to keep someone engaged. So are there specific things that any of you can think of that sort of are useful in really pulling in that supply chain and keeping that society piece together and invested?
Tricky, because it is globally so different, right? I mean, because we do have other geographies where we just have a complete different starting point. I think the interesting challenge here, and sorry that I talk a lot about challenge, that's maybe the nature of a consultant, but the interesting challenge, of course, maybe what I didn't say on the West Coast is on the East Coast, we still have Europe to help, right? I mean, whenever it didn't work, we could bring, we don't have that here really. I mean, the Pacific is pretty big, you know that, so bringing everything from Asia won't be an option. So we need to solve things here. I mean, that's maybe, so therefore we have to solve a few things here locally. I mean, we generally always experience quite an openness when you talk to suppliers that currently work in the other spaces, say, we have offshore. I mean, we shouldn't, again, underestimate the context of sustainability, right? Contributing to more sustainable projects. It actually attracts suppliers also from other industries. So, and I do think, without having made the assessment here on the West Coast, I'm very certain you will find a lot of things that you can already supply here, tier 2, tier 3, into projects. And then again, we do have, floating wind is still a very, very young industry. So you shouldn't underestimate the potential maybe for California to become the pioneer in some of the technologies and even becoming an export union. And you probably won't export floating structures towards Asia, but maybe you will export, maybe you become the best in mooring line design and fabrication and other topics. So I think that's also a tremendous opportunity because the whole Pacific region is a huge floating wind space. Yep. So something maybe we should also not underestimate, which is maybe again a bit different to the East Coast, where it's on bottom fixed, you're competing with Europe. But here the Pacific is full of floating wind opportunities, right? So yeah, how to frame that really is difficult. And the problem with getting the society involved, I mean, that was also the most challenge for me in the 3.5 minutes with the Uber driver, is really to convince someone that's an investment beyond one generation, right? That's a very human problem we're having beyond my life and the cost I have to carry. That's of course where we need to come up with this long-term vision. Yep. I mean, yeah, and I think that's of course always an uphill battle to convince people on the long-term contribution to the society, to the environment. But I think that must be it. But yeah, so far whenever we approach suppliers in other states, I mean, we were running through open doors. They were very interested, also workforce very interested to get trained. I mean, I think Kelly, I mean, I just sneaked into the session before. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate workforce. Yep. I mean, there's maybe another big learning, right? I mean, I still remember the UK many years ago. They said we want to fabricate locally. I said a great idea, but there was no welder in the country, right? Because they all left already decades ago. So start early to train workforce, because it takes some time to get the required resources together. That's also something we shouldn't underestimate at all. So still a lot to do.
Yes. Saul, Michelle, any thoughts?
Okay. So I have a couple comments here. I think from where I sit, I engage with suppliers quite a lot. I also engage with a lot of professionals or aspiring professionals. And I want to address both those. I think, especially for those in the industry who live here in California, I encourage you to serve as a resource to aspiring professionals in your community. I grew up on a Navajo reservation, Native American reservation in Arizona, and there I was looking for some visibility of what was possible. And thinking about the session yesterday with the tribal members, I think we have a large role as an industry and as humans to help younger people understand what's possible. And I think in this industry, there is a lot of possibility. I work very hard, or I try very hard to recruit in California, but the industry, the skill isn't there yet for some of the things that we need in these early stages of development. And for it to get there, we need to encourage people to go and get the experience, to get the education, et cetera, to, as the cliche goes, study in school. And so I think we can help provide that pathway for people as individuals to grow and therefore to grow an industry. And we've seen that in other parts of the world. We see that in Houston, admittedly oil and gas and not renewables, but we see that, that brain power. We see it in Aberdeen, Scotland. We see it in other places around the world where there's been this cluster of knowledge that's kind of self-reinforcing. And the dream here is that that would happen for offshore wind in California if we invest at the scale. So as individuals, I really encourage you to do that. As companies, what I see is two different sides of it. I see outside companies with experience in other markets, Europe, now the East Coast, Asia, asking how they can get involved, and in some cases looking for local partners that can serve as partners, let's say, on the ground with California experience. And so I think if you're a California company looking to partner with an outside, a company with experience in another market, come and talk to us. We have professionals on staff explicitly here to help make these introductions, to help develop the supply chain. That's part of our task. Come talk to me. And one of the reasons that's really important, and this is kind of directed at the companies from other markets, when you come into California, it's really important that supply chain partners from other markets understand how important it is to engage with the communities, to treat the communities well, and to, frankly, have the knowledge to go through the administrative process, the permitting process, et cetera. And so I think that local partnership with that outside skill set can be a powerful model. There are other models, but it's really powerful. And we very much, as we're working towards these projects in the years to come, we very much want to and are investing in helping facilitate that supply chain development. So please come and ask for help.
That's great. That's super helpful, Saul, both of you. Okay, we're winding down on time here. We've got three fantastic different perspectives sitting on the stage. So to sort of wrap up and leave folks with key points from each of your perspectives, just sort of give us the roundup of the key things that Vestas is really focused on in terms of supply chain.
Yeah, I think key message to walk away with is really to set up the market in a way that attracts investments across the entire value chain or ecosystem by providing this long-term predictable volume, executing on a clear schedule through procurement, and really avoiding domestic manufacturing requirements as a condition for offtake. So really setting up the market in a way that builds the foundation for a viable and cost-competitive supply chain. Really, if you build it, they will come. So the supply chain will follow suit if the conditions are right.
Mm-hmm. Great. Tim.
I will try to stop with something positive, right? I talked enough about changes. So echoing what you said, I think it is a tremendous opportunity you're having here on the West Coast in the whole Pacific region. And we should also, I mean, there's still a lot of time, right? Until the projects are really in the water, it will still take a bit of time. So it's a tremendous opportunity. It's a very new market. I think the West Coast has shown in many other sectors to be very innovative. So I think, there's enough time to really see what's really in it for us here, or for you on the West Coast. So I think we should really look at the opportunities and really dig into the innovation part of it. One thing I also haven't mentioned, I think you have a tremendous also potential in capital here. You have a lot of IT, in the IT sector that is just, they're just needing whatever green electrons you can provide them, right? So maybe even corporate PPAs different to other regions. So I think you have the ingredients here are fantastic. Maybe even looking at the whole Pacific region as an export opportunity is just fantastic. Still a couple of things to be solved, but we still have some time. And good for you is also there are other markets that are a little bit more ahead. Yep. I think we will probably learn a lot from Scotland. We will learn a lot from other floating markets, and then incorporating that into the California story is, is promising. Yep.
Okay.
I think the main thing to leave with is the combined message of congratulations. And serious congratulations to the policymakers in California and nationally for the progress. And we need to have the visibility. The industry needs the visibility on the procurement, and as well as on the infrastructure, the ports, the transmission, et cetera. That visibility needs to be there. And if that visibility is there, then the supply chain will follow. And then for the supply chain partners, RWE and the other developers have invested a lot in California. And so while we talk about the challenges, please take that as a strong signal of our belief that there is a strong market here. As you look at some of the slides that have been up over the couple days, and the wind resource that's available, and the market that is demanding clean power, that wind resource plus clean power, we believe results in a very promising market. And so we're very positive about it. I encourage you to be very positive about it. And finally, I think this is really important to say every time, is really encourage the supply chain partners to focus on doing the right thing for the communities, and being a positive player in this market. I think that is the main takeaway. We will be working with people who develop strong relationships in the community. Thank you.
That's great.
You allow me one?
Please, go ahead.
Because I just want to quote one, and I want to quote Paul James. I hope it's okay, Paul James, if you're in the room here, from Equinor, with whom we had, with Equinor, we had a great innovation workshop at Berkeley University in the stadium of Berkeley. And I think he said something nice, but what you also kind of said now. I think the developers, you need to join in or develop the stadium. And once the stadium is built, we can start to compete, right? But it's a joint effort from all the developers. It's a joint effort from the industry. I think that is super important, and I think that really illustrates it a lot. So we have to, first of all, join forces to prepare what we all need. And then once that's all existing, you can start to compete on price and best technology. Yep. But we need that, I think, joining forces. And I think that I found a very, very important and good comment.
Well, I think that's such an important point. And one, California has a little bit differently than sort of the East Coast, right? With so many states that line the East Coast and decisions and goals of their own, California has that opportunity, at least for now, within the state, to really join all of those forces, join all of these different perspectives, and be able to come up with that pathway to success, whether it's procurement, whether it's attracting investment, whether it's job creation. All of that can tie together with, I think, the proper pathway and sort of outlook to this region. And so just want to take a minute to thank the panelists and the time, and I think all these perspectives are incredibly useful. This is my third of these conferences now, and I have continued to see the challenges being met and everyone trying to really tackle them and continue to overcome, and that's really what I anticipate we'll continue to do to get a successful California market. So thank you all so much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you for everyone for listening in.